Hey everyone. So apparently, theist Sean Lindbergh here has a question for atheists regarding evidence. What's on your mind, Sean?
Here's a question for my atheist friends. What must God do to prove to you that He exists and that it matters?
Well, that would technically be two things, but fortunately, they both kind of go hand in hand. To answer the first, I specifically don't know what specific evidence it would take for your God to convince me that it absolutely exists. Because humans don't have access to what we would call absolute truth or objective reality due to the subjective nature of our inaccessible personal experiences, it behooves us as critical thinkers to try and methodologically improve the likelihood of any given proposition so that we know we're as close to truth as possible, which means that even if an entity suddenly appeared before me and claimed that it was the Christian God, there would be no means for me in that moment to eliminate the possibility that this entity was just something that was claiming to be the Christian God, or, and more likely, that it's just a hallucination. But I can say that even if this God were to exist and did possess the attributes that you think it possesses, then it definitely would know what evidence it would take to convince me, and thus far has chosen not to present it. And to address the second part, if a God were to exist, then that would mean that that proposition was true. And to me, truth is what matters, so just being demonstrated to be true would be why it would matter if it existed.
Well, at 15 years old, I was a militant, anti-Christian atheist.
While I would say that that is a pretty intense label for someone to hold for themselves, especially at the tender age of 15, I'm sure you had your reasons for it.
But I was searching for answers, and so I gave God a challenge.
Oh, okay, so you were an agnostic atheist, which is a very important distinction to make. You didn't know if a God existed or not, and because you didn't know, therefore belief in its existence was unwarranted.
Prove to me in black and white that you exist and that it matters, and I will become a Christian.
So you posed a bargain to the God to give you evidence of its existence, and then in exchange for that evidence, you would then sign yourself over to the Christian faith. It's a little disconcerting, the lack of critical thinking there, because even if you were to suddenly get evidence, by what mechanism would you be able to determine that it came from a Christian God, unless you had already concluded prior to the bargain that the Christian God was the only thing of that nature that could exist? But I may be jumping ahead, so tell us what happened.
Well, 7 years later, over a period of about 2 years,
Wow, this is incredibly problematic, and for a number of reasons. First, 7 years later over a period of 2 years? Was it 7 years later before the period of 2 years, which would then technically make it 9 years? Or was it 5 years later before the 2-year period began? You probably could have worded that a little bit better, Sean. Second, why would it take your God such a long amount of time to actually do anything, given that the entity itself would ostensibly know that a single event would be far more effective evidence, as opposed to, say, multiple events spread out over a 2-year period that can't be differentiated from coincidence or confirmation bias. Third, you said you were an atheist when you posed the bargain, but that would kind of imply that any evidence that you potentially could come across in the future would be interpreted critically and not through the lens of confirmation bias. So by what mechanism were you able to determine that what you were interpreting was actually evidence coming directly from the Christian God, and not just a collection of patterns that fit what you expected to see, because you'd already concluded for yourself exactly what this evidence that this supposed entity would give to you to demonstrate its existence would look like? But to be perfectly fair, given the timeline that you've presented, you were likely between the ages of 22 and 24 when all of this went down, which is probably what accounts for the overall lack in your critical thinking.
God gave me the proof that I needed to believe that He is God and that it matters, that He exists and that it matters.
Okay, awesome. Your God gave you evidence that it exists. Care to share what that evidence was with anyone else?
And I became a Christian. Well, that was the deal.
So you're not going to share the evidence that convinced you. You just expect us to take your word for it. If memory serves, that's pretty much the historical reason why we're having this conversation now.
But I was never happy with Christianity, and it took 25 years for me to realize that Christianity is a meaningless franchise.
So you're not a Christian, you're actually a deist.
So I gave up the Christian label, but not my belief in God's existence and that the Bible is God's revelation to humanity.
Okay, my bad. Seems I was wrong. Apparently you're a non-denominational Christian? Honestly, it's kind of tough to tell, seeing as how you didn't mention anything about Christ or the resurrection. But since you did finish with an appeal to the Bible, I guess you're implying that you do accept these fundamental tenets, despite there being absolutely zero evidence that any of those myths are true. Remember, Sean, the existence of a godlike entity and the truth of the Bible are completely separate claims. Unless, of course, you somehow have the ability to differentiate between an entity that mimics and claims it is the Christian God and the Christian God itself. Like I said before, you probably could have worded this a bit better. But the biggest issue here, Sean, is that you claimed that your God presented evidence to you, but you failed to present that evidence to anyone else, which implies that you've recognized that the evidence that convinced you is not actually good evidence, and so likely wouldn't convince anyone else, because what you're calling evidence is likely just your personal feelings. And that's why you've made this video here, where you're basically asking people to open themselves up to accepting confirmation bias, and therefore also believe in the existence of a God for the same terrible reason you do. My recommendation, Sean, when you say you have evidence, be prepared to present that evidence, and never forget that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. Be safe, be excellent to each other. I'll see you next time.